On a grey October morning in Miller's Gulch, Montana, 40 people stood at a produce auction and watched one woman bid on garbage. That's what they called it. Garbage. 200 tons of bruised, split and rejected pumpkins that a canning plant 3 counties over couldn't use. Dented orange mountains sitting in a field, already going soft at the edges, smelling faintly of rot in the autumn sun. The auctioneer almost laughed when Josie Calloway raised her hand for the whole lot at less than 4 cents a pound. The kind of price that told everyone in that field exactly how worthless the crowd thought this pile really was. Someone in the back, a rancher named Dale Fenwick, a man who'd never missed a chance to remind Josie, whose family used to own the biggest spread in the valley, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "She's finally lost it, feeding her cattle Halloween leftovers." Josie didn't answer. She just signed the paper. Nobody in that field knew that in just over 3 months, the worst blizzard in 30 years would bury the valley in 4 feet of snow, freeze the hay supply chain solid, and leave half the ranchers in that county staring at empty barns and dying cattle. And nobody knew that the only herd walking out of that winter fat, healthy, and whole would belong to the woman they'd just laughed at. This is that story. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you're going to look at a pumpkin patch completely differently. And if you've ever been mocked for a decision that turned out to be the smartest thing you ever did, I want to hear about it in the comments. Also, if you're new here, hit subscribe now, because this channel is full of true-to-life farm stories just like this one, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Josie Calloway was 38 years old, and running the ranch her father, Elmer Calloway, had nearly lost twice, once to a drought in the 80s, once to the man now laughing at her across the auction lot. Dale Fenwick's family bank had held the note on Calloway land for 2 generations, and Dale never let Josie forget it. That year had been brutal before winter even arrived. A summer drought had scorched the hayfields across 3 states. Alfalfa that normally sold for $90 a ton was pushing $240, and even at that price, supply was drying up. Every rancher in the valley was doing the same math Josie was doing. How many bales do I have? How many mouths do I need to feed? And how many months of winter am I short? Josie was short. Badly short. She needed roughly 60 more tons of feed than her barn currently held, and at market price, that would cost her nearly $15,000 she didn't have. The bank, Dale's bank, had already turned down her loan request that spring, and the rejection letter still sat unopened on Josie's kitchen table for 3 days before her husband, Hank, finally threw it out so she'd stop looking at it every morning. The Calloway Ranch wasn't just land to Josie. It was 4 generations deep, going back to her great-grandfather, who'd broken this same ground with a team of horses in the 1920s. Josie's father, Elmer, had come within 1 bad season of losing it twice, and Josie had grown up hearing those stories at the dinner table. The year the well ran dry, the year half the calves were lost to blackleg, the year Dale's father sat across from Elmer at that same bank and told him the note was coming due, whether the rain came or not. Josie had promised herself as a girl that she would never sit in that chair. That October, watching the drought numbers and the feed prices climb together, she was terrified she was about to. That's when Josie's neighbor, an old-timer named Silas Whitlock, who'd spent 40 years as a large animal vet before retiring to raise goats, mentioned something almost as an afterthought over coffee. "You know," Silas said, "my grandfather ran cattle through the Depression on squash and pumpkins when hay ran short. Pound for pound, a good pumpkin's got more usable energy and water content than half the junk we feed cows now. Vitamin A off the charts. Fiber in the flesh. Even the seeds are worth something. Natural dewormer, believe it or not." Josie had heard the same thing from her own grandmother once, a story she'd dismissed as old-timer folklore. But 2 days later, she found herself calling around, and that's when she heard about the pumpkins. Quick question before we go further. If you've got livestock of your own, drop a comment and tell me what unconventional feed you've used in a pinch. I want to know if this is more common than people think. Here's what Josie learned, and what most people watching this don't know. A pumpkin isn't just Halloween decoration. Nutritionally, a mature field pumpkin is roughly 90% water, which sounds like a downside until you realize that in winter, keeping livestock hydrated is half the battle. Frozen water troughs are one of the leading causes of weight loss and dehydration-related illness in cattle during cold snaps. That water content, combined with natural sugars in the flesh, made pumpkins an easy, palatable supplement that cattle would eat readily, even picky ones. The flesh itself carries decent fiber and a surprising amount of beta-carotene, which converts to vitamin A, critical for immune function, vision, and reproductive health in cattle, especially pregnant cows heading into calving season. Hay that's been cut and stored for months loses a lot of its vitamin content. Fresh pumpkin flesh doesn't have that problem, and the seeds, this is the part that made Silas's eyes light up when he talked about it, contain cucurbitacin, a compound long used in folk veterinary medicine as a natural way to help manage internal parasites in livestock. It's not a replacement for real veterinary care, but as a supplemental benefit riding along with a feed source you're already using, it's a bonus most modern ranchers have completely forgotten about. The catch, and this is important, is that pumpkins alone can't replace a balanced diet. They're a supplement, not a substitute. Josie understood that. Her plan wasn't to feed pumpkins exclusively. It was to stretch her existing hay by cutting each cow's hay ration and filling the gap with pumpkin, effectively making her limited hay supply last through a winter it never would have covered alone. 200 tons, bought for pennies on the dollar because a canning plant considered them cosmetically unfit for sale, was enough bulk to bridge that gap for her entire herd of 110 head. There was also a practical side most people never think about. Pumpkins are soft. Unlike root vegetables such as turnips or beets, which sometimes need to be chopped to prevent choking hazards in cattle, a mature field pumpkin splits easily underfoot or under a hoof, and cattle learn quickly how to break into one on their own. Josie still cut the largest ones in half with a hatchet before setting them out, just to be safe, especially for younger stock. Silas was firm about introducing the pumpkins gradually too. Dumping a new feed source on cattle all at once can upset their digestion, so Josie mixed small amounts in with the regular hay ration for the first 10 days, slowly increasing the proportion until the herd was comfortable with it. It was one more piece of unglamorous, careful work that nobody watching from the road ever saw. Word travels fast in a small ranching town, and by the following week, everyone knew what Josie had done. The reaction wasn't curiosity, it was ridicule. At the feed store, a farmer named Roy Higgins asked her, straight-faced, if she was planning to carve her herd a jack-o'-lantern for Christmas. At church, Dale Fenwick made a point of mentioning it during coffee hour, calling it the Calloway curse acting up again, a jab at Josie's father's old troubles. Even Josie's husband, Hank, admitted later that he'd had a knot in his stomach the whole drive home from that auction, watching truckload after truckload of dented pumpkins get piled up beside their equipment barn, a temporary dumping ground until Josie could figure out a real way to store 200 tons of produce that wasn't built to last the winter. He kept wondering if they'd just spent money they didn't have on something that would simply rot before it ever got used, because that was the real risk nobody was talking about. 200 tons of pumpkin doesn't keep like hay. Left in a pile, pumpkins break down fast, especially with any moisture or warmth. If Josie didn't manage that pile correctly, rotating it, keeping it dry, feeding it down in the right order, she could lose the entire investment to rot before the first snow even fell, and she'd have nothing left to show for it but an empty savings account and a barn full of mush. So for 3 straight weeks in November, Josie and Silas worked from before sunrise, building what Silas called pumpkin cribs, slatted wooden pens that let air circulate through the pile, kept the fruit off the wet ground, and let them pull from the bottom while fresh loads went on top. It was backbreaking, unglamorous work, hauling half-rotten pumpkins in the cold while their neighbors watched from the road and shook their heads. Hank would bring coffee out to the barn some evenings and find Josie sitting on an overturned bucket, exhausted, staring at the pile. "You think this is going to work?" he asked her once. "I think," she said, "we don't have another option, so it has to." Neither of them knew yet just how right or how close to disaster that answer would turn out to be. The storm arrived on the second week of January, and it arrived with a fury nobody in the valley had planned for. Weather services called it a 100-year event, sustained winds over 50 miles an hour, 4 feet of snow in 36 hours, and temperatures that dropped to 19 below zero. Roads closed, power lines went down across 3 counties, and critically, every hay delivery truck scheduled to bring in supplemental feed from out of state got stranded or turned back. For ranchers who were already running thin on hay before the storm, this was catastrophic. Cattle that go too long without adequate feed and water in extreme cold don't just lose weight, their body temperature regulation fails, and in the worst cases, they die where they stand. Over the following 10 days, as the county slowly dug out, the losses became public knowledge. Roy Higgins lost 11 head. Another rancher 2 farms over lost nearly 20% of his herd. Even Dale Fenwick, for all his mockery, had to truck in emergency feed at nearly 4 times the normal price, and still lost cattle to the cold. Josie's herd didn't lose a single animal. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without fear. On the second night of the storm, with wind chills near 40 below, Josie and Silas made the trek out to the crib, by rope, tied between the house and the barn, because visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and getting lost in your own yard was a real way to die out there. Hank stood at the window with a lantern the whole time, watching for their shapes to reappear out of the white. "I kept thinking," he said later, "that we'd bet everything on a pile of pumpkins, and if something happened to either of them out there, none of it would have mattered anyway." But every morning through the worst of the storm, Josie and Silas trudged out to the pumpkin cribs, broke through the frozen crust, and hauled feed to cattle that were eating well, staying hydrated from the pumpkin's water content, even as their troughs iced over, and holding their body condition through weather that was breaking herds all around them. Her hay stretched exactly as far as she'd calculated, with almost 2 weeks to spare before spring green up. What changed the town wasn't the numbers, though the numbers mattered. It was what happened after. When the roads finally cleared, Josie loaded her truck with the last of her surplus pumpkin feed, nearly 30 tons she hadn't needed, and drove it over to Roy Higgins's place without being asked. Roy, a man who'd made the jack-o'-lantern joke 3 months earlier, stood in his driveway and didn't say a word for a long moment. Then he just nodded, and the 2 of them spent the afternoon feeding Roy's remaining herd together in silence. Josie did the same for 2 other struggling neighbors that week. Not out of pride, and not to prove anyone wrong, Hank said later that was the part that surprised him most, that she never once brought up the mockery, never said, "I told you so." She just showed up with a truck full of the thing everyone had laughed at her for buying. Dale Fenwick, of all people, was the one who finally said it out loud at the spring cattlemen's meeting. He stood up, looked across the room at Josie, and said, "I've known this family a long time, and I said some things this winter I shouldn't have. Josie Calloway didn't get lucky. She got smart and the rest of us got humbled. The room went quiet, and then, slowly, people started clapping. Josie Calloway's ranch is still standing today, and every October, when the local canning plant has its cosmetic rejects, her truck is first in line at that auction. Other ranches in the valley have started doing the same. What was once considered garbage, split pumpkins, dented squash, produced too ugly for grocery shelves, has become, in that corner of Montana, a respected piece of winter feed strategy. The real lesson here isn't really about pumpkins. It's about the cost of dismissing an idea just because it looks strange from the outside, and the quiet courage it takes to follow through on a plan when everyone around you is laughing. Josie didn't have more money than her neighbors that year. She had more information, more preparation, and the will to endure being wrong-sounding until the day she was proven right. Sometimes the smartest move on a ranch, or in life, doesn't look smart at all until the weather changes. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel is built on true rural stories like Josie's, and we've got a lot more coming. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from tonight. And if you've ever been mocked for a decision on your farm or ranch that turned out to be exactly the right call, tell us about it below. I read every single one, and your story might be the next one we tell.